The world teetered on the brink. Two superpowers, locked in an existential struggle, armed with the power to annihilate civilization. But the battlefield wasn't always visible. It was fought in the shadows, in clandestine operations, and in the hidden corners of the globe. This is the story of the CIA and the secret wars of the Cold War. Imagine a world fractured. On one side, the United States, championing democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, spreading communism and revolution. This wasn't just an ideological clash. It was a global chess match, played out with espionage, proxy conflicts, and the constant threat of nuclear war. And at the heart of America's hidden hand, pulling the strings in this dangerous game, was the Central Intelligence Agency. Born from the ashes of World War II, the CIA was designed to be America's eyes and ears, its first line of defense against the Soviet menace. But it quickly evolved into something far more potent. It became an instrument of foreign policy, a tool for shaping events far from American shores, often with consequences that echoed for decades. Think about it. The official narrative of the Cold War is one of clear ideological divides, of grand pronouncements and public posturing. But beneath that surface, a different kind of war was raging. A war of whispers, of sabotage, of coup d'etat. A war where the victor wasn't always clear, and the price of failure was immense. The early days were rife with suspicion and fear. The Iron Curtain had descended, and Soviet influence seemed to be expanding at an alarming rate. From Europe to Asia, the domino theory held sway. If one nation fell to communism, others would surely follow. The CIA, under the direction of men like Allen Dulles, became convinced that decisive action was necessary. They believed that simply containing Soviet expansion wasn't enough. They had to actively roll it back. One of the first major theaters for this covert struggle was Iran. In 1953, Iran was led by a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who sought to nationalize the country's oil industry, a move that threatened the interests of British petroleum. The United States, fearing that Mossadegh was leaning towards the Soviet Union, saw an opportunity. Operation Ajax, as it was codenamed, was a masterpiece of clandestine manipulation. The CIA, working with British intelligence, orchestrated a propaganda campaign, bribed politicians and military leaders, and even staged a coup. Mossadegh was overthrown, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a staunchly pro-Western ruler, was restored to power. On the surface, it looked like a victory for American interests. The Shah remained a close ally, and Western oil companies regained their access. But the long-term consequences were devastating. The overthrow of a democratically elected leader bred deep resentment among the Iranian people. This resentment would fester for decades, ultimately contributing to the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the rise of anti-American sentiment that continues to this day. Was this a successful intervention or a catastrophic miscalculation? The answer, like so many of these secret wars, is complicated. Then there was Guatemala. In 1954, another democratically elected leader, President Jacobo Arbenz, implemented land reforms that threatened the vast holdings of the American-owned United Fruit Company. Again, the CIA saw a communist threat, where others saw legitimate reform. Operation PB Success was a textbook example of a covert operation designed to destabilize a government. The CIA armed and trained a small rebel force, launched a propaganda campaign painting Arbenz as a communist puppet, and even used fabricated news reports to create the illusion of a widespread popular uprising. The psychological warfare was relentless. The result? Arbenz was forced to resign, and a military dictatorship, installed and supported by the United States, took control. The land reforms were reversed, and the United Fruit Company's interests were secured. But the cost was a brutal repression of dissent, a civil war that lasted for decades, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans, many of them indigenous people. Was protecting corporate interests worth the immense human suffering? It's a question that haunts the legacy of this era. These early interventions set a pattern. The CIA, driven by a potent mix of anti-communist fervor, genuine concern for national security, and sometimes a desire to protect American economic interests, began to operate with increasing boldness. They saw themselves as the architects of a new world order, a bulwark against the spread of communism. But who was truly defining the threat? And who was deciding when and where America should intervene? The decisions were often made by a small group of individuals, operating in secrecy, with limited oversight. The public, for the most part, remained unaware of the extent of these operations. Consider the mindset of the time. The fear of communism was palpable. The Soviet Union was seen as an implacable enemy, seeking to undermine Western democracies at every turn. The CIA, in its own eyes, was fighting a necessary war, a war to preserve freedom. But in their pursuit of this goal, they often employed tactics that were far from democratic themselves. The narrative of the Cold War was often presented as a struggle between good and evil. But the reality was far grayer. The lines between protecting national interests and interfering in the internal affairs of sovereign nations became increasingly blurred. And the consequences of these interventions, often borne by the people of the countries involved, were profound and long-lasting. Think about the sheer audacity of these operations. The CIA wasn't just gathering intelligence. They were actively shaping political landscapes, overthrowing governments, and supporting authoritarian regimes. They were playing a dangerous game, a game with incredibly high stakes. And the dominoes, the very ones they feared would fall, were often toppled by their own interventions. The resentment bred by these actions created fertile ground for anti-American sentiment, and in some cases, for the very ideologies they were trying to combat. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, a cycle of intervention and backlash. The scope of these secret wars was staggering. From the streets of Tehran to the jungles of Central America, the CIA was a constant, unseen presence. They were involved in everything from propaganda and psychological warfare to direct support for paramilitary groups and even assassination plots. The narrative that emerges is one of a powerful agency, operating with immense resources and often with limited accountability. They were the architects of a hidden foreign policy, one that often contradicted the stated values of American democracy. But why were these operations so effective, at least in the short term? It was a combination of factors. The element of surprise was crucial. The lack of public awareness allowed them to operate with a degree of freedom that would be impossible in a transparent democracy. They were also skilled in the art of deception, in manipulating information, and in exploiting existing divisions within target countries. And let's not forget the context of the Cold War itself. The intense rivalry between the US and the USSR created a climate of fear and suspicion, where any perceived threat from the other side was met with a swift and often aggressive response. The CIA was, in many ways, a product of its time, a reflection of the anxieties and ambitions of a nation locked in a global struggle for dominance. But as we delve deeper into these secret wars, a crucial question emerges. Were these interventions truly protecting American interests, or were they creating more problems than they solved? Were they safeguarding democracy or undermining it through their own actions? The early successes, like the restoration of the Shah in Iran, masked a growing undercurrent of instability and resentment. The seeds of future conflicts were being sown in these clandestine operations. The CIA's reach extended far beyond the initial interventions in Iran and Guatemala. As the Cold War intensified, so did the agency's covert activities. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the islands of Southeast Asia, American intelligence was actively involved in shaping the outcomes of conflicts, often with devastating consequences. One of the most significant and controversial chapters in the CIA's secret wars involved Latin America. This region, often referred to as America's backyard, became a hotbed of proxy conflicts and ideological battles. The fear of a communist domino effect here was particularly acute. In Cuba, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a stark reminder of the challenges and dangers of covert action. The CIA, under the new Kennedy administration, supported an invasion by Cuban exiles aimed at overthrowing Fidel Castro. But the operation was a disaster. The exiles were poorly equipped and trained, and the invasion was quickly repelled. It was a humiliating public failure for the agency and a major propaganda victory for Castro. Yet the CIA didn't give up on Cuba. They continued to plot against Castro, exploring various and often bizarre assassination plots, ranging from poisoned wetsuits to exploding seashells. These efforts, while ultimately unsuccessful in removing Castro, highlight the lengths to which the agency was willing to go. The story of Chile in the early 1970s is another potent example. The democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, came to power in 1970. The United States, fearing a socialist foothold in the region, saw Allende as a threat. The CIA, under the Nixon administration, launched a campaign to destabilize Allende's government. This wasn't a direct invasion, but a sophisticated campaign of economic pressure, propaganda, and support for opposition groups. The goal was to create chaos and make the country ungovernable, paving the way for a military coup. And that's precisely what happened in 1973. General Augusto Pinochet, a brutal dictator, overthrew Allende, leading to a reign of terror characterized by widespread human rights abuses. The CIA's role in the Pinochet coup remains a subject of intense debate, but declassified documents have revealed the extent of their involvement in undermining Allende's government. Was this a necessary evil to prevent communism, or a direct assault on democracy by a superpower? The consequences for the Chilean people were undeniably tragic. Thousands were killed or disappeared, and the country suffered under decades of authoritarian rule. And what about Southeast Asia? The Vietnam War is often seen as a conventional conflict, but the CIA played a significant, often hidden, role in its escalation and in supporting anti-communist forces throughout the region. In Laos, for example, the CIA ran a secret war for years, supporting Hmong tribesmen against the communist Pathet Lao. This was a massive undertaking, involving airlifts, training, and extensive funding. It was a war fought in the shadows, largely unknown to the American public, and with devastating consequences for the Laotian people. The bombing campaigns, for instance, left the country heavily mined and scarred. These operations weren't just about fighting communism. They were about shaping the global balance of power. The CIA was often the instrument through which the United States projected its influence, its will, and its fear onto the world stage. But with this power came immense responsibility and a growing question of oversight. Who was truly in control? And were the ends always justifying the means? The secrecy surrounding these operations meant that accountability was often elusive. Mistakes were made, lives were lost, and in some cases, the unintended consequences of these actions created new problems that would plague the region for decades. The CIA's secret wars were not a monolithic effort. They were a series of distinct operations, each with its own motivations, its own methods, and its own unique set of consequences. But they shared a common thread: the belief that the United States, through clandestine means, could shape the destiny of nations and protect its interests in a dangerous world. The motivations behind these interventions were complex. There was genuine fear of Soviet expansion and the spread of communism, There was a desire to protect American economic interests abroad. And there was, undoubtedly, a sense of American exceptionalism, a belief that the United States had a unique role to play in shaping the global order. But the methods employed were often deeply problematic. The overthrow of democratically elected governments, the support for authoritarian regimes, and the widespread use of propaganda and disinformation blurred the lines between protecting democracy and undermining it. Think about the psychological impact of these operations, the constant fear of subversion, the paranoia that fueled so many of these interventions, created a climate where legitimate political dissent could be easily labeled as communist agitation. This allowed the CIA to operate with a degree of impunity, often with the tacit approval of political leaders who were themselves caught in the grip of Cold War anxieties. The consequences of these secret wars were not confined to the immediate aftermath. The resentment and instability they often created would fester for years, even decades, contributing to future conflicts and shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that are still felt today. The CIA's secret wars were a testament to the power of covert action, but also a stark reminder of its inherent dangers. They were a period of intense global struggle, where the lines between right and wrong, between intervention and interference, were often tragically blurred. And as we look back on this history, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from these clandestine operations, and how do they continue to shape our world today? The shadow war waged by the CIA during the Cold War was not confined to distant, exotic lands, nor was it a detached, clinical exercise in geopolitical maneuvering. Instead, it bled insidiously into the very fabric of American society, a disquieting testament to the pervasive, almost suffocating fear that gripped the nation. This existential struggle against communism, a perceived monolithic, all-consuming threat, fostered an environment where paranoia could flourish like a noxious weed, and where the lines between legitimate national security concerns and overzealous, often brutal repression became dangerously blurred, almost indistinguishable. The agency, born from the ashes of World War II with the ambitious mandate to gather intelligence and ruthlessly protect American interests, had evolved with alarming speed into a powerful, frequently unchecked instrument of foreign policy. Its shadowy tentacles reached into every conceivable corner of the globe where ideological battle lines were drawn, its influence subtly, and sometimes violently, shaping the destinies of nations. Consider, for a moment, the chilling efficiency with which the CIA cultivated its vast, unseen army of informants and assets. This was a network operating in the perpetual twilight of secrecy, a legion of individuals whose existence was, for the most part, unknown to the very populations they influenced, or in some cases actively worked against. These were not always the hardened spies or seasoned defectors one might imagine from pulp novels. Often they were ordinary citizens, their lives ordinary until they were drawn into the clandestine world, lured by a potent, often intoxicating mix of ideology, financial incentives, or a deeply ingrained, if sometimes misguided, sense of patriotism. They were the bright-eyed students in Prague, yearning for a taste of Western freedom, the stoic dock workers in Valparaiso, Chile, their livelihoods precarious and their political leanings easily swayed, the erudite intellectuals in Cairo, caught in the swirling currents of post-colonial politics. Their lives, once predictable, became irrevocably altered by the clandestine currents that flowed beneath the seemingly placid surface of everyday existence, currents that the CIA expertly manipulated. The agency's reach was profound, its methods astonishingly varied, and its impact frequently devastating, leaving behind a trail of disrupted lives and fractured societies. The domino theory, a potent and terrifying metaphor that painted Southeast Asia as a precariously balanced row of vulnerable nations poised to tumble one by one into the abyss of communism, became a self-fulfilling prophecy in many respects. The intervention in Vietnam, while often characterized in the public consciousness as a direct, albeit controversial, military engagement, was also deeply, inextricably intertwined with a vast array of covert operations. The CIA's role in Laos, in particular, the so-called secret war, stands as a stark and brutal illustration of this complex, often morally compromised interplay of overt and covert action. While American B-52 bombers unleashed their devastating payloads on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and North Vietnamese positions, a seemingly decisive military effort, the agency was simultaneously and covertly arming, training, and directing Hmong tribesmen in a brutal, unforgiving guerrilla campaign. This was a war fought not on the grand, visible battlefield of international diplomacy, but in the dense, suffocating jungles and remote, isolated villages, a brutal proxy engagement that left an indelible, agonizing scar on the Laotian landscape, and more importantly, on its people. The Hmong promised liberation from communist oppression and a brighter, more prosperous future, were ultimately and heartlessly abandoned, their ancestral villages decimated, their traditional way of life shattered into a million pieces. Was this a successful, even necessary defense of American interests, a bulwark against the spread of communism, or was it a tragic, unforgivable entanglement that cost countless innocent lives and sowed the seeds of enduring resentment that would fester for generations? The agency's activities, however, were by no means limited to overt coups or the clandestine arming of insurgents. Disinformation and propaganda were equally, if not more, potent weapons in the vast, multifaceted arsenal of the Cold War. The CIA possessed an acute, almost visceral understanding of the power of narrative, the profound ability of a carefully crafted story to shape public opinion, to sow discord within adversary nations, and to undermine the very foundations of their governments. Through a labyrinthine network of front organizations, seemingly independent media outlets, and carefully crafted news stories disseminated through strategic manipulation of communication channels, the agency worked tirelessly to undermine governments deemed unfriendly to American interests. These governments, often democratically elected, were frequently portrayed through a distorted lens as Soviet stooges, dangerous radicals, or puppets of Moscow, thereby justifying covert or overt intervention. In Iran, the dramatic restoration of the Shah in 1953, a pivotal moment in modern Iranian history, was accompanied by a sophisticated and highly effective propaganda campaign. This campaign meticulously demonized Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic and popular leader, portraying him as an unstable nationalist manipulated by communist forces. The narrative, painstakingly crafted by intelligence operatives and disseminated through various channels, painted a terrifying picture of imminent Soviet takeover, a scenario designed to evoke visceral fear and thereby justify the audacious overthrow of a democratically elected leader. The long-term consequences of this intervention, however, proved to be far more damaging and far-reaching than initially anticipated. The deep-seated resentment sown by the perceived Western interference festered, a wound that would never truly heal, ultimately contributing to the potent anti-American sentiment that would later fuel the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The Shah, propped up by the immense power and influence of American backing, ruled with an iron fist, his brutal secret police, the SAVAK, employing methods that chillingly mirrored the very totalitarianism and repression that America claimed to oppose. Similarly, in Guatemala, the CIA's Operation PB Success in 1954 stands as a chilling masterclass in psychological warfare. President Jacobo Arbenz, a democratically elected reformer, had enacted progressive land reforms that directly threatened the immense economic interests of the powerful United Fruit Company, a prominent American corporation. The CIA, acting effectively as the armed wing of these corporate interests, launched an insidious campaign of radio broadcasts, strategically placed leaflets, and fabricated news reports meticulously designed to create an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, depicting Arbenz as a communist puppet and a threat to national stability. A small, hastily assembled mercenary force, trained and equipped by the agency, then invaded the country, leading to Arbenz's forced resignation and the installation of a brutal military dictatorship. The ensuing decades of devastating civil war and systematic repression in Guatemala stand as a grim and undeniable testament to the catastrophic unintended consequences of such interventions, a stark and tragic reminder that the relentless pursuit of perceived national security can, and often does, lead to profound human rights abuses and prolonged, agonizing instability. The chilling reality that permeated these clandestine operations was the inherent moral ambiguity that defined them. Were these interventions truly designed to protect and preserve American democracy, or were they a cynical, self-serving manipulation of democratic ideals to serve purely economic or geopolitical ambitions? The architects of these secret wars operated under the dangerous and ethically bankrupt assumption that the ends unequivocally justified the means, that the threat of communism was so profound, so all-encompassing, that any action, however morally questionable, however reprehensible, was permissible in its containment. But who then was ultimately accountable for the lives shattered, the democracies undermined, the vicious cycles of violence unleashed upon unsuspecting populations? The impenetrable veil of secrecy that shrouded these operations made accountability a near impossibility, a phantom concept that eluded any meaningful pursuit. The American public, largely unaware of the true extent of CIA involvement or the devastating consequences of its actions, was left to grapple with a sanitized, surface-level narrative, while the true, horrific cost of these clandestine battles remained hidden, buried deep in the shadows. The agency's methods were not always subtle. Indeed, at times, they bordered on the absurd, yet underscored a deeply unsettling willingness to employ extreme measures. The assassination plots against Fidel Castro, a series of desperate, elaborate, and ultimately futile attempts, highlight the agency's willingness to resort to extreme, even theatrical, violence when faced with a seemingly intractable adversary. From poisoned cigars designed to induce a fatal heart attack to exploding seashells intended to detonate on Castro's yacht, the sheer ingenuity and relentless persistence of these plots, while bordering on the comical, underscore a deeply disturbing aspect of the Cold War: the willingness of a powerful, ostensibly democratic nation to resort to clandestine murder and outright violence to achieve its foreign policy objectives. These operations, even in their spectacular failure, contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion, further solidifying Castro's grip on power and inadvertently pushing Cuba further into the Soviet orbit, a testament to the often counterproductive nature of such clandestine endeavors. Across the vast expanse of the globe, the narrative of the Cold War was never a simple, clean-cut binary of good versus evil, of the shining beacon of democracy versus the oppressive darkness of totalitarianism. It was instead a complex, intricate tapestry woven with the threads of ideology, economics, raw national ambition, and, most importantly, profound human suffering. The CIA, as a central and often unseen actor in this global drama, played a pivotal, though frequently controversial role in shaping its tumultuous course. Its actions were often driven by a potent, volatile cocktail of genuine, deeply ingrained fear and an unwavering belief in American exceptionalism, the notion that the United States was uniquely destined to lead and shape the world. The secret wars it waged were